Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan Javraj. Join us for insightful conversations with leaders in Islamic and global markets. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can also reach us at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com and follow us on LinkedIn. Today, we're talking about sustainability and ESG. Sustainability and ESG are now key priorities in the GCC. With green bonds, sustainable loans, and major projects like Masdar City and NEOM driving change. But are banks and financial institutions and corporates doing enough? And how does the GCC compare globally? To answer these questions, we spoke to Daniel Gribbin, Deloitte Middle East Sustainability and ESG Lead. With over a decade of experience and recognition as a top ESG leader in the region, Daniel shares his insights on the region's sustainable future. Daniel Gribbin, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Hassan.
Daniel, I've come across your profile before. You've done some really impressive work in the sustainability and ESG field, particularly in the GCC. But before we get into talking about, sustainability, ESG, oil, and all these different nice topics in the GCC, could you give our listeners your early life and your background story?
Yeah, absolutely. Love to. So I was born and raised in Melbourne, Australia. I was fortunate enough to study economics commerce through my university degrees. And in doing both economics commerce back in sort of 2004, 2005, I studied a lot of environmental economics, social economics, population growth economics. And at the conclusion of that, we didn't really have an economics degree that was a proper degree at that point in time, but I effectively got something like an environmental economics or ESG economics degree out of it. And I sort of fell into some work with KPMG, which was really fortunate at the time. So they were a new sustainability and climate practice back in 2009 or so. And I got some intern work with them, and they realized, of course, that this was sort of a growing market, and that, from there I became their first graduate, and was able to sort of grow and progress through my career, working with, many of Australia's, mining and metals companies in particular, many of our banking clients, and then towards sort of the end of time that I had in Australia with sort of the food and beverage and the agriculture clients that we had, as Australia started to really have, feel the effects of climate change, which was, a really good way to start my career into sustainability.
Fantastic. And what made you want to go into this field?
To be honest, I was probably a bit lucky. I sort of fell into it a little bit, as I said, through what happened in my university degree, but also my parents. So my mum worked with the Victorian government and later with the South Australian government, and she was always very heavily involved in water. And in Australia, where we were suffering particularly a lot of drought, she worked very hard to make some of our key waterways and our key rivers work again and to flow again, as a public servant, and later as the Commissioner for Water Security in South Australia, where she was building things like desalination plants. So I sort of got a bit of a green thumb or a sustainable thumb from that. But then, as I said, I was fortunate enough to sort of get some intern work back then, and the rest is, as they say, history.
And then you transitioned to the Middle East after that?
Yeah, correct. So I fortunately got married at the end of 2017, and about 2 weeks later, my wife and I moved over to the UAE, where I joined a director over here with KPMG, and we started up the sustainability and climate, or ESG, practice within there, which is very interesting. So by that time, the climate sustainability ESG world in Australia had got quite mature. A lot of the work we were doing is more in sort of the audit and verification space, and the opportunity to come over to the Middle East represented sort of helping, clients and customers who are very much in the early parts of their journey, helping them with their strategies, with their data collection, with, their reporting further down the line, and sort of some of these more primal, I suppose, sustainability needs that these companies have, which was a really good experience and continues to be to this day.
Fantastic. And Daniel, we've had conversations. I was mentioning to you offline, we had conversations with people who have researched and done PhDs and, helping in the advocacy and the policy area. But for somebody, who's working directly with, say, companies and family offices and other institutions and organizations, trying to be more, let's say, ESG or more sustainably focused, what do you do like on a day-to-day basis to help your clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as I said, we were really in an early journey here in the GCC. From a practical perspective, there's a variety of things that we support with. If we look at some of the newer companies that have been set up or those who are really early in this journey, a lot of it is actually helping integrate sustainability into their existing strategy. Previously boards and executives have really thought about sustainability from a financial lens only. So we help them integrate, what is the vision for sustainability within the organization? Often they're already doing sustainable activities that they're not aware of. So bringing that to the attention of leadership. And then we help them with things like data collection and KPI setting. So what is a achievable set of KPIs that they should be collecting? What are the material topics that they should be following? How do they get this data proactively? Often that starts with very basic sort of manual spreadsheets, etc. And as they get more mature, we'll go into digital systems and automation and others. And then all the way through to, how do they disclose this? And a bigger part that's coming up here in the Middle East as we start to diversify economically is, getting access to international money. So helping them actually tell their story in a sustainable way or verify the disclosures that they want to make to the market.
Amazing. Daniel, you've also worked, like, say, on the corporate side as well, not only just on the consulting side, but I just want to take a step back a little bit and just ask you, maybe this seems like a bit of a basic question, but what exactly is ESG and what exactly is sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question because they're terms that are really used interchangeably. I mean, for me, it has a different, I suppose, resonance and purpose. I have two young boys and I want them to have a future. And I want them to be able to live in a world where they don't need to worry about climate change. They don't need to be worried about food security. They don't need to be worried about these sorts of issues that we're facing today. But that is a really macro issue and a macro topic. So if you actually look at the origins of the term sustainability, which comes from sustainable development back in the 80s, which was, to meet the needs of the future without compromising the needs of today, or vice versa, meet the needs of today without compromising the needs of the future. And that is a really hard term to put into perspective. So for me, it comes through the kids. But for corporates, the challenge they had is, okay, how do we make this really big visionary term of what's going to happen 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now? And how do I turn that into an everyday strategy or an everyday way of measuring success? And that's where we started to get into this development from an investor lens of environmental social governance metrics, or ESG. So what we were trying to do there and what the world was trying to do was come up with a more quantifiable and smaller way of depackaging this big concept, so that we can compare apples with apples and actually see, is one company performing better, likely to be more sustainable into the future, through a set of metrics, through a set of KPIs, and then we can sort of assess this going forward. So that's sort of the evolution of where we've got to it now. It's still going to continue evolving, I think, over time into what does the definition of success look like. But it is trying to, at the moment, unpackage this really complex issue of how do we have a world 50, 100 years from now that our kids can live in.
And for somebody, you mentioned you came from Australia and you worked there, and then you moved to the Middle East. What would you say, like, in terms of the journey in the Middle East, particularly? Would you say it's still quite a nascent journey?
Yeah, it is quite early. It's still quite nascent, as you say. We've got some players in the market who are moving, at a very good pace. I would still say they're, 4 to 5 years behind what we're doing in the Western world. But we've also got some that are very, very immature. They haven't started to collect data, and really that's being driven by a regulatory environment. We have a culture here in the Middle East that is very much driven by regulation. And so until we get the regulatory frameworks and support, and we have laws coming in next year in the UAE, I think, which people are excited to see about how that works out, we will still sort of see this 2 or 3 paced approach to people reporting and people going on their sustainability journey at different paces.
When we talk about ESG, one of the things, if a lot of people focus on the E, or environmental, I think when, this market really probably took off probably in 2018, 2017, and then during the pandemic, you've seen like a big spike in like, say, green bonds and sustainable bonds. Would you say there's been a bit of an overemphasis on the E from a lot of market players?
Yeah, I think there has. There's certainly a focus on the E because it's more tangible. You can see physical changes in climate, or you can see spills, or you can see effects on biodiversity. The S side, some of it, is very easily seen, particularly on the health and safety side. We see of that. But one of the things that I've talked to people about, and I think those of us in the profession are very cognizant of, is that without the social bit, without the education, without the equality in life, without the stability that is required within the world, we will never get to a place where the E or the G is actually pulling its weight hard enough. So the S is a very strong point that is not often given enough focus as it needs, I should say. And we really need people to be educated, to be, paid well, to have, minimal human rights violations. We need to have fair and equitable workplaces and geopolitical situations, because without it, it will never be able to, conquer climate change, or ensure that we have clean drinking water, or, make sure that people are treating the land as appropriately as they can.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, I remember when Qatar won the World Cup to host the World Cup in 2010, and throughout that period until 2022, there was a lot of criticism from Western media about the social conditions for a lot of the workers that were building the stadiums. Do you think that amplified the more S impact for ESG, like across the Gulf?
I certainly do think it did. The whole region here is going on a transformation, whether it be from the environmental side or the social side. I think the region wants to be a player on the global stage, and events like the Qatar World Cup, or the events that are going to be hosted in Saudi, and the investments that they're doing there, mean that you are going to have a spotlight on your activities and the way you treat your people. So if we look at the Qatar World Cup, for example, yes, certainly in those early years there were some things that went wrong in the way that they were managing, or that the contractors were managing their people, and they went on a transformation to try and solve that problem and try and change it over time. There is certainly more work that needs to be done, but they went on a journey and saw some excellent results for what they were setting out to do. But I think as a region, as you get that spotlight on you more, you need to become more transparent. You need to have better practices, and this will only further itself with the spotlight coming into whether it's Saudi Arabia, or whether it was UAE with COP last year, or various other sort of mega events that the region wants to be central to.
I just want to focus on COP. Obviously COP29 is taking place, or has taken place, in Azerbaijan this year. COP29, COP28, which took place in the UAE last year, received a lot of fanfare, and there was a lot of criticism from media in the West and in other countries as well. Do you think, as someone who's working with companies in this region, there's been a bit of the post honeymoon period that is not as being talked about as much as it was, say, 2 or 3 years ago?
I don't know if it's the post-honeymoon period, but I think what we saw in last year, in the years leading up to COP, was a certain level of proactiveness, maybe not in tangible outcomes, however. We saw companies, to be frank, perhaps a little bit of greenwashing, a little bit of, minor disclosure that was going on, because, as I said, they didn't have the regulatory framework. I think what COP did, and the signing of some of the agreements, particularly the phasing out of fossil fuels, is it started to make the ministries and the governments within the region think and act about how they actually meet net zero. So, as I sort of said, this UAE law that will come into effect is the first step of that in the right direction, I think, here in the region. And there's plenty more that they can do, but I think also it's the international funding lens is a big one also. I don't think you're ever going to, not ever is maybe not the right word, but it's going to take a bit of time before a Middle Eastern company, sets the world alight like a Unilever, or some of these who are considered the the world's most leading sustainable entities, but they are starting to push that agenda up and up. And we've got a younger generation that's coming through that'll start to be leading these entities. And we've got a very diverse pool of people within here, within the Middle East, who want to see it moved, towards that more sustainable future.
And do you think a lot of them just jumped on the bandwagon to attract ESG funding? Because I think, as you mentioned, right, there was a lot of accusations of greenwashing, not just in the Middle East, but across the world to attract financing. But obviously in the US now, with a more Republican outlook in the next 4 years, and there's been a bit of a pushback towards ESG initiatives. Not saying that in Europe and in Asia it seems to still be there, but do you think in terms of the financing aspect, there's less emphasis on ESG?
I don't know if there's less emphasis as much as it's become a bit more BAU. And I think it's still part of the integrated decision making that people make. I think there are certain challenges with the geopolitical landscape. Deloitte, we recently did a survey of over 2,000 C-suite executives, and climate change, for example, still came out as the number one issue facing those, particularly in the GCC. It was number one. I think it was top three globally. But that's ahead of things like political instability and some of the geopolitical issues that the Gulf region faces. So I think executives are still aware of this and recognise that more needs to be done. But on the financing perspective, I think it's sort of become a bit of BAU, which is what it needs to be. We need to be making standard low carbon investments and low carbon transitions going forward. So it's a little bit of, maybe it's not exactly as it's played out in the media. There are other studies that show the resilience of the markets earlier this year for those who had stronger ESG practices than others. So there's a bit of proof that's around there, but we're trying to develop a system here with sustainability and ESG to compare markets and to make financial decisions and to allow investors to have comfort that took the financial world hundreds of years to evolve. And we're trying to do it in sort of 20 to 30 years in a sustainability perspective. So there's always going to be evolutions and changes in that, as we go forward.
How do you convince a CEO or somebody who runs a company in the GCC, to adhere to ESG practices and to tell him or tell them it won't impact or it will have a beneficial impact on the ROI or the returns of their company?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's a very hard conversation to have. I think it does come a lot down to mindset. Fortunately within the GCC, a lot of the entities are influenced by government and by the sovereign wealth funds who have a much more long-term view of what they want the economy to look like and what they want the resilience of these companies to look like going forward. And that's really beneficial because if we then get a mandate from senior leaders, it is often followed by executives. When I'm talking to C-suite executives, there often needs to be a lot of empirical evidence. So we need to show them the benefits of running a green program. We need to show that they have got the return on investments. If we look at green bonds, they're often oversubscribed in the region. And there's a lot of international attention and looking for that going forward. So there is a lot of evidence in there. Let's be frank here. If someone doesn't believe in the concept of sustainability, it's very hard to change their mind. Let's just call a spade a spade. But I think most people, once you start to throw that bigger picture, that longer term picture out there, they get it and they understand it. And then once they start to see it through their investors and the questions that they're getting within their organization, then they start to believe a little bit more. And, it might only take one grain of sand, but if we keep building on that with them, they will eventually sort of, tip a point and start to do this in a really BAU manner.
But Daniel, isn't part of the problem a lot of this, as you mentioned before, is the data collection? And as you know, someone who's worked at the GCC, transparency is not a big thing. Transparency is a difficult thing, and the quality of the data and the monitoring of the data can be quite difficult. Have you come across these challenges before?
Yeah, data is the biggest issue we have here, to be frank. So that as I sort of say, those top handful of companies that are leading the way, they're the ones who have got a grasp on data. I'm not saying that they're doing it as well as the rest of the world, but that they're the ones grasping it at the moment. But there is still a long way to go, particularly through the whole supply chain, to get really reliable and quality data. I think for us, what we're hoping is the new IFRS updates as well, the S1 and S2 standards, which will make this part of a financial auditor's remit. Once these get adopted, which we are hearing whispers it will happen in the next sort of 12 to 24 months, that this will improve that level of data reliance and give more emphasis to the data that is collected. But you're right, we do need to get that level of data up. We do need to get that level of transparency up, because that, at the end of the day, is what builds trust. And the region is trying to build trust on a global stage here. And that's really key to underpinning that.
Do you think, like with, like, say, regional companies or family offices, if we take out the internationals for a second, that the people running these organizations or the management at these organizations, they understand like the importance of data disclosure and transparency? Do you think they understand that, or do you think it's still a work in progress?
I think some of them do. If I look at someone like a Majid Al Futtaim in the UAE, who's sort of recognised as a bit of a leader in this space, they've been doing this for a number of years now, and I think as a private business, they get the importance of this, and they've sort of benefited from the early adopter perspective. I think, to your point, some of the other ones and the other sort of private and family businesses is a little bit more convincing as required. But what we're seeing is the next generation of leaders who are coming through are the ones who are starting to put the emphasis on that, which is where I think we will get that step change in that sort of, moderate middle of the groups of entities within the region who are needed to really shift the dial on that. But it's a very fair point from a domestic and from a local perspective that does need to be a significant change, and we'll probably get that also through regulation as well as those younger leaders coming into power.
Speaking of regulation, Daniel, one thing I remember writing last year was about ADGM's sustainability finance framework. And, it was very well received by the market. But one person did mention to me at the time that it wasn't a mandatory, like, sort of taxonomy. And I've seen like other frameworks, for example, I think the GCC stock markets themselves all collectively launched an ESG framework for disclosure for listed companies in 2023. But again, this is a voluntary thing. It's not like a mandatory thing, right?
Correct. Yeah. So most of the standards in the region are voluntary, or if they have got a level of mandatory, it's more of a carrot than a stick type solution. So very different to the CSRD or the European requirements that have come in through the taxonomy. The law coming in next year in May, we're still looking to see how that will actually be applied, but that focuses very much on climate risks and opportunities and the reporting of climate data, which I think will be a very key movement going forward. But yeah, I think we do need greater reporting, and hopefully this IFRS requirement, when it is adopted, and I know it's getting translated into local standards as we speak, so that's why I say it's a matter of time of when, not if, that comes into place, will actually really increase the level of disclosure we get and the level of mandatory disclosure going forward.
One thing that's interesting to me is when I did some research last year on looking at Islamic finance institutions, so banks and funds that signed up to the PRB, the Principles of Responsible Banking, or the PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment, both like really robust frameworks initiated by the UN. One thing that stood out to me was that there wasn't that many Middle Eastern banks or financial institutions that signed up to these frameworks, but instead a lot of them did their own like frameworks. Why do you think that a lot of them don't really sign up to these more international ones?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues. One, I think, is that the Middle East is a bit, when they do sign up to international commitments, they want to make sure that they're doing them right, because if they don't do them right, they get some very negative backlash. So they want to make sure that they have got all their ducks in a row before they commit to some of these elements. I think the other one is just as we sort of said before, it's some of the data constraints, the procedural constraints, some of the disclosure constraints that we have that need to be addressed before they can actually take this forward in a robust manner.
And then, Daniel, I guess like there's two things in my head that come with ESG and sustainability in the GCC. Is that one, the GCC, it's although it's 6 countries that have similarities, they all are at different stages of sustainability, right? In terms of regulations and implementation.
Yeah, very much so. So I think if we look at it, the UAE is probably leading. Saudi is very close behind. We look at Oman and some of the others, they've brought in, as we said before, some of the voluntary reporting requirements. So there is lots happening across the GCC. We do see different requirements. So, whether it's the Public Investment Fund in Saudi putting in requirements on all its companies, whether it's Mubadala looking at their responsible investing frameworks. These are sort of the other metrics that are moving the dial a bit, but we do see a lot of different pace happening within the region and within the GCC.
But Daniel, doesn't this come back to the point that I think you mentioned earlier, is that oil and gas are not going away, right? And a big part of their economies in the GCC and indeed other Middle Eastern countries is that oil and gas still play a big role. And if you look at the oil and gas exports and production, they're still going up compared to, say, the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think, I talk about this all the time. We're not going to phase out oil and gas immediately. I know there's a lot of people out there who would like to do that. And don't get me wrong, yes, it would solve some of the challenges we face. However, there is two sides to this coin. We still need to, as I said before, develop the social side. So we need to also look at the demand. And still we will have demand globally for plastics or other products that use oil and gas. We still need to get people transferred by vehicle in developing countries across Africa and India and South America and other areas. So there is a two-sided coin to this, where, oil and gas will need to play a role until we get those economies to a place where EVs or substitutions for plastics or whatever it is that needs to happen into the economy can occur, and we can actually reduce production appropriately and in line with demand. So there is it's a double-edged sword there when it comes to the production versus demand of the product.
And do you see like things like green and sustainable bonds like becoming more prominent again, or do you think a lot of them, they'll just be part of the more broader capital markets ecosystem?
I think they've gone through a bit of a peak over the last 5 years or so. I think they'll just become another general product. I think we're still seeing some other products come out in the market here in the GCC. So whether they're green loans or green credit cards or various other financial products that are coming in, we're seeing a lot of reliance on rating agencies and other verification programs that are occurring. But the finance, I think, we'll have sovereign wealth funds. We will have the funding here still look to invest in green solutions. But what I'm sort of seeing and what I also hope is that it becomes more of a BAU process that supports the transition rather than an exceptional out of the box performance.
And Daniel, what do you think of the next couple of years for ESG and sustainability in the Gulf? Do you think it's like going to be an improving story, or do you think it's going to take a bit of time to realize the ambitions?
I mean, the amazing thing about the Gulf is that the leadership really has, we talk about Vision 2030 in Saudi or 2031 in the UAE or Qatar National Vision, etc. They set visions for long terms and they start to invest and follow through with it. You only have to look back to the UAE 30 years ago to see how much it's changed in alignment with, Sheikh Zayed's vision and the vision of the country, etc. So I think the leadership here, once they stick their mind to it and once they put their mind to it, has the ability to create transformation. So I suppose my hope is that we really move in accelerated pace. I see a lot of companies trying to do that. It just comes back to that point earlier about we need the education, we need the awareness of both our staff, our supply chains, our various other parts of the economy that can actually enable this and make sure that it's a just transition and that we build our ESG credentials in the right way.
What about other GCC countries like, say, Kuwait or Qatar? Don't seem to be on the agenda so much.
Yeah, Kuwait is starting to do some things we've been noticing. So we've started to receive more inquiries from Kuwaiti-based companies. So they are starting to think about it, but they do tend to move sort of a few years behind, the UAEs and Saudis of the GCC. The same thing with Qatar. So Qatar, I think, went through that big transformation with the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup happening there. They've had a slight cooling off, but now they're actually back on the agenda with the central bank and Qatar Energy and QIA and these large multinationals that they have, bringing ESG back to the front and trying to actually start to embed practices and actually transform the economy.
And what about so I don't mean just to go on the GCC, but if you look at Bahrain and Oman, do you think they're doing a good job as well?
Bahrain and Oman, I mean, I think that I put them in a similar bucket to sort of the Kuwait. To be honest here, I think Bahrain has moved quite significantly in recent history. I think they've got a very big focus. They also have some big companies there in the relay of oil and gas and aluminium and others. Oman tends to be a little bit slower, but it is a facilitator. They actually have some companies doing some really great things, such as some of their LNG companies and some of their shipping companies, etc., that are doing really great transformations, but they don't actually publicize themselves as much as other GCC countries. So I think they are moving, but it's a slower step change than we might see in some of the other Gulf countries.
Yeah, I think the other big thing here is the marketing, right? It's like how you present yourself to the wider world and wider community of sustainability is like what you're actually doing. I think we had a guest on. She mentioned about Oman's green hydrogen plans and some of the other projects they're doing, and like I was quite surprised to hear what Oman is doing. But and also I was going to say on Bahrain, I just returned from there a few days ago, and it was quite interesting. I didn't see that many EVs on the road there. And people were still leaving their cars on while they were going to, say, for example, to a restaurant or something. So I guess the mindset still needs to be changing. But Daniel, tell us more any projects you're working on, any upcoming things you're working on.
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of work, and I won't be able to sort of name names, but we're working with a lot of the, particularly the Saudi entities that are public investment fund subsidiaries who are trying to transform their organization. We're working with oil and gas companies to help transform. They recognize that they need to go and be in a low carbon economy, and they need to start to raise funds and figure out ways to actually transform their work going forward. We're working with banks on, their internal processes from, how do they actually change their credit process? How do they build in due diligence to their lending? Things of this nature from an ESG perspective. And we also work with a variety of, private companies, as I said, as well, who are sort of starting to push the envelope or looking into the international requirements. The CSRD and the CBAM regulations in Europe have caused a bit more disruption in the Middle East as well, with people realizing that they can't just have their head in the sand. They do need to build in sustainable practices, which is really good. And, a part of Deloitte's role is supporting the transition there. So making sure that they have a future, helping them actually get to that low carbon economy, and supporting them in the right way.
And Daniel, what's the best way to reach you or to read your work?
Yeah, so probably through our Deloitte.com website or through my LinkedIn. We're constantly posting and keeping up to date on that. We like to bring out thought leadership quite frequently across the Deloitte platforms and also from me personally. But yeah, and then happy to connect personally over there or over any of those platforms.
I'll link it in the show notes. But Daniel Grimond, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I wish you all the best for the rest of 24 and going into 25.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me again.